inviting me to speak today. Greatly enjoying the conference. So I'm going to be talking to you about graffiti paint. I've got some slides to show you from some of the cases that I've been working on. For those of you who aren't familiar with the setup in the United Kingdom, I work for a company called LGC Forensics, which many people in the audience probably remember as Forensic Alliance. It's been merged with LGC, and LGC Forensics is a new entity that we're now umbrellaed under. And I'm actually based in a laboratory right in the middle of England, sort of towards the bottom near Oxfordshire, a very beautiful place to work in. My background, as Amy introduced me, is I was a paint chemist. I was a paint chemist for 8 years, and so that's my real love, really. And so although I'm now working in trace evidence, paint is really my roots. Just as an introduction, when I first started working at ICI, in fact, my very first day, they took me around what was then the decorative departments of the laboratories, and it was split into decorative and it was split into automotive. So Leonora this morning was talking about automotive paints. I set foot into the automotive paint department and found out instantly that I was allergic to isocyanates. And at that point, my career took a dive straight down decorative paints. And so automotive paints is not an area of expertise I know an awfully lot about. Following on from that, I spent at least 2 years training to be a formulating chemist. And so I have made many thousands of litres of the stuff, and learned fairly on in my career that being able to make paint in a laboratory on a small scale doesn't necessarily mean you can scale it up to manufacturing. And just quickly, I'll tell you a story that I learnt very early to take very good notice of paint chemistry. I'm very aware that black carbon black pigment, I know now, has a very large surface area. And if you are to dump it into a 20,000 litre tub and don't mix it fast enough, it sets solid. And that was my first batch that I ever made. It took them 2 weeks to dig it out from a mixer. So if you were ever to look down the microscope and find a black paint, I'd like you to remember somewhere along the line someone's had to make that very carefully. So I'm going to be introducing graffiti paint as a trace evidence, and I joined then Forensic Alliance back in 2003, primarily as a paint chemist, under the tutelage of Pam Hamer, which I know a lot of you know. For those of you who don't, Pam is mostly our equivalent in the UK of Skip, so I've had some very good grounding. As a background to graffiti, there's been a lot of presentations over the last few days, mainly centering on homicide cases, which of course are a big part of what we do. But moving on slightly to a more commercial problem in the UK is actually graffiti. And the police forces in the UK are split up into, I think it's 43 different forces. And one of those forces is the British Transport Police, who are in charge of basically all the tracks and trains that run around the whole of the United Kingdom. And so one of their main problems, one of their main commercial problems, is actually vandalism. I'm sure it's much similar as the United States. But every time somebody actually commits one of these acts of vandalism, the police need to try and be able to track down who's done it. So our involvement happens basically with a submission in the laboratory. If a graffiti has taken place that's deemed to be substantial, so perhaps that particular train that's been graffitied has been taken out of action. I think worldwide the British Transport Police spend nearly $20 million US trying to clear up this problem. So it's a huge problem for them. The last few slides I've showed you, and this slide as well, shows you some of the items that we can get in. And so if graffiti's happened, then the police, the scenes of crime police officers will go in and they actually scratch paint flakes for us as a control sample. So this is showing you some of the items that we might receive, scrapings of paint. I'm never sure whether police taking these scrapings actually causes more damage than the graffiti would take to wash off, but that's what we end up with. Of course, the first thing to do is to try and organise your controls. And I think to date, my worst graffiti case happened at a train sidings where 8 carriages of train were completely covered in graffiti, basically overnight. And I think we were dealing with over 30 or 40 different colours from that one case alone. And so the organisation of your paint samples is quite important. So I've just got a list here of some of the controls from a particular case. A lot of the items that we received into the laboratory have been seized from suspects who've maybe identified from the crime scene, either under CCTV, who've actually been apprehended at the scene. And just because someone's at a scene, obviously things like train stations, it's not illegal to be there. So just finding them in the vicinity is not enough. And draw your attention to the rucksack. Your heart sinks on a Monday morning when you have one item submitted and you open the rucksack and it contains 25 different spray cans. So suddenly the week becomes a bit longer. Obviously, spray cans aren't the only use on the side of trains for vandalism. People are often etching, scratching glass and using big thick pens, but that's actually something I'm not going to be talking about in this particular session. Obviously that's a different type of trace evidence. This is a photograph in the laboratory of what paint actually looks like when you've been in the vicinity of spraying paint. And Skip jumped a little bit for me this morning when he actually gave a background. So for those of you who were there this morning, hopefully there's an understanding of what we're looking for here. When you're in the vicinity of spraying paint, the paint actually forms very small microscopical balls, which are actually hollow. They're actually hollow. And they're exceptionally regular in size and shape, and that size and shape can be a consequence of what kind of paint you're dealing with, and also a consequence of the actual nozzle size itself, and they can also be a consequence of things like wind and temperature. And it is impossible to be in the close vicinity of spraying a spray can without actually having these spray can balls landing on your clothing and on your hair and on your glasses. It's actually impossible to be there. And there's various studies that have backed this up. But being in the vicinity of spraying paint doesn't mean that you're actually the sprayer. If I was to spray paint standing here and someone was immediately next to me, they would also be subjected to this aerosol cloud of spray paint. It is sometimes possible to examine an item and make some kind of assessment of whether perhaps somebody might have been spraying paint. For example, if you were to examine a whole sweatshirt and find a much greater population of these spray paint balls, perhaps on the right cuff, then you might be able to get an indication that that particular area has been in much closer vicinity of a spray can being sprayed. I would never want to go as far as to say that just because that's a high population of paintballs, that particular person is the actual sprayer. I wouldn't want to go quite that far. And when Skip was talking about his case this morning, he was actually looking for these paintballs which have been secondary transferred. And what I tend to look for in the laboratory is I'm actually looking for paint that's fairly well adhering, because taking out the secondary transfer possibility, if I move on a slide here, I've selected to show you paintballs which actually have been enclosed around particular fibres of clothing. And there's no way that that's a secondary transfer. This person has been in the vicinity of wet paint which is being sprayed. Just to draw your attention to this lovely paintball in the middle, these things are about 50 microns, so they're very tiny. It's extremely tiring to search an entire item for paintballs. This particular paintball here is giving you some indication of perhaps a layering sequence. So this particular individual has sprayed red paint first, moved on to yellow, and then moved on to black. But because these paintballs are so tiny, this is actually quite quite a rare thing to see. And although I can't exclude the possibility, obviously, that someone's gone back and done it in a sequence again, this actually is giving us some indication that might be useful later on to the police if they can perhaps tie up CCTV activity. As a presentation of some of the results that we've had in our laboratory, between 2006 and 2007, it's actually about a 14-month time delay. I've selected 20 graffiti cases which were sent to me to the laboratory. Now, not all these particular graffiti cases involved items of clothing. Some of these particular graffiti cases actually involve spray cans. And what tends to happen is if someone's apprehended at the scene or is identified from CCTV, the police can actually either take spray cans from people's possessions, perhaps in the case of the rucksack, maybe they're actually in the rucksack, but often sometimes from people's homes. And also we get quite a lot of spray cans which are left at the scene. Obviously, if they're empty, they're no use to people. Thank you. They're no use to people, so they're left at the scene. And it's quite a good indication of whether using sort of cross techniques, that spray can might be subjected to fingerprinting. It might be subjected to DNA. We have on occasion had fibres stuck to the top of the wet paint that have actually dried, sort of where they've landed, and so it can be quite a cross-disciplinary type of evidence. So of the 67 spray cans that I've had submitted, the largest population of those spray cans is this particular brand here. This is Pintura, and for those of you who are paint examiners, I believe Pintura is a worldwide, well-distributed manufacturer. Let's just pull all these up here. So Belt and Maltau is another huge number of spray cans that we actually get into the laboratory. And what's interesting about these two brands, the first two brands here, is they're only available by mail order, by specialists, artists paint. And interestingly enough, if you ever to look at a can on it, it does tell you not to use them for illegal purposes. Those two particular brands are actually making up the bulk of what we're seeing in the laboratory. There's various other manufacturing spray cans that we see quite often as well. And mixed in there where it says others, you've got your things like radiator paint. I suspect it's whatever Mum and Dad had in the garage at the time. In the UK, there's actually a law which prevents under 18s from buying spray cans. I'm not sure if that's the case in the US. But the problem with the first two brands here is that because they're mail order, obviously I'm not quite sure what the process is of ensuring that whoever's buying those particular cans are over 18. I haven't really got a feel for whether these cans are being stolen or not. I think that would be a really nice area to be able to hook up with the police and find out. Just to show you, for those of you who aren't paint examiners, what we actually do with the paint once we've got it. So this particular picture is of a green paint. Dark field microscopy. As I said, I was under the tutelage of Pam Hamer, so microscopy is fast becoming one of my loves. And paint under the microscope is incredibly beautiful. What this particular picture is showing is this is green paint, but by the time you've got up to this kind of magnification, you can start to see that it's made up of yellow and blue pigments. There's very few actual true green pigments. So we can start to make an assessment, really, of what the paint is and how it's put together. This is an orange spray can, and I'm showing this one to show you some of the morphology that we can see under the microscope. For those of you who've ever used a spray can, it says quite clearly on the side of the can to shake it before you use it. And I know for a fact that this isn't done in most cases for graffiti paints. Obviously, standing there shaking a can for 2 minutes before people catch you isn't something that they want to do. And so consequently, a lot of the cans get blocked. But when I had a can into the laboratory, I shook it for the recommended time and sprayed it. And this is the morphology I was getting, so I was introducing plenty of air into it. The next thing that I tend to do is I tend to do a full comparison. And by far the best way of comparing paint is by using your eyes. Over the last few days, we've seen many excellent presentations of all the different huge pieces of analytical equipment that are available to us as a toolkit as such. But a still best way for me to look at paint is to use your eyes down the microscope. My boss, Dr. Angela Gallup, produced a paper many years ago where she said that a good human visual expert can actually tell the difference between up to 10 million different colours. I'm not sure whether that was calculated or whether she had a poor student in at the time. I suspect it was calculated. But anyone with really, really good colour vision actually can start to see differences fairly quickly. And one of the problems that you need to be very careful about is that that's not an artefact of light. And so when I'm comparing my paint, I like to put my paint slides, my paint samples next to each other. This particular case was a spray can that was received into the laboratory, had lots of controls, and I had the whole spray can really, so trace evidence perhaps is a bit of a naughty term for this one. This is lots and lots of sample. And on first glance, they actually look extremely similar colours. It's a purple spray can. We've got inclusions, these large particles in there, and it looks very, very similar. By the time we start looking at these samples through a blue light, so we filtered it through blue light, we start to see that the paint's reacting in a slightly different way, and that sets alarm bells ringing. So at that point, although we've got paint that looks the same colour, actually the binder, what's actually holding the paint together, is starting to react differently. This is through ultraviolet, and you can clearly see these different paints at this point. Just as a summing up of the rest of the cans that made up those 20 cases that we've had in, the vast majority of those are 400 millilitres, and for those who've actually done some spraying, that's your standard size can. I've not had a chance to talk much about the nozzles. If you're interested, if you read my paper that's been included in the CD, the nozzle's actually a big part to the artists themselves. And you can buy many different kinds of nozzles. Some give you nice coverage, some give you very fine coverage. And quite often when we receive paint into the laboratory, paint spray cans into the laboratory, the nozzles actually aren't present, they're taken off, and that stops the cans being accidentally released. And so if we do have a nozzle present, quite often it's because the police have caught them in the act rather than afterwards. Another thing that's quite surprising is that most of these cans aren't empty. You would think that people would use a spray can to its completion and then throw it away and pick up another one, but they're not. They're frequently nearly full, and part of the reason I think that this is happening is because the graffiti that's being done is very carefully planned. It's very intricate. There's lots of different colours, and so a particular spray can is used on many different situations. Let me just pull all these ones. Oh, let's go backwards. That brings an interesting point, because part of the problem with identifying whether an offender's actually sprayed a particular graffiti is the fact that most of these graffiti artists are prolific sprayers, and just finding paint on them isn't enough. They could have legitimately been spraying on a legal wall, for example. And so part of our armoury to track them down is to find out the frequency that the colours are occurring. So if you've got a controlled paint graffiti area with perhaps 20 or 30 different colours, if you were to find all those colours on a particular suspect, then it increases your evidential value quite a lot. And until I started putting this presentation together, I was fairly sure that some colours were more common than others. If I had a black or a silver, I was giving it, in my mind, slightly less evidential value than perhaps a pink or a purple. But actually, as I started looking at the figures here, that's not particularly the case, although there are more black paints coming up. I was quite amazed at the fact that there's quite a wide spread. And I'm wondering whether part of that is if you buy these specialist spray cans, if you buy Pintura, for example, you actually get a huge discount if you buy a mixture of colours. So if you were to buy 50 cans, they would actually send you a mixture of colours. And so I'm wondering really whether that's what's happening. So it's very difficult, really, to make an assessment based on colour. It is the combination of colours that we have to use. These are just the figures associated with that. If you're interested to have a look. And really, that's my roundup of some of the casework. So thank you very much for listening.